Moccasin Trail, Chapter 11. In the morning, Jim wondered if he could possibly have dreamt the whole thing. Jonathan and Sally greeted him exactly as usual, asked not one question as to where he had been or what he had done, and did their best to pretend the quarrel had never been. This went on for several days. Jim was not urged inside the cabin. Where he slept or how he dressed was never mentioned. Even when yesterday's rumors concerning the mysterious Indian with the scars began to drift up the Tualatin, becoming less fanciful and more shrewdly speculative all the time, Johnny held his peace. He merely advised Jim not to take off his shirt when there were other settlers around. Jim began to wonder incredulously if he'd won his battle overnight. Then, one morning, Daniel asked an innocent question. "Hey, listen, Jim, how come you don't just go ahead and cut them braids off now? Sis says she's bound she'll make you do it sooner or later." Jim froze. "A crow wears his hair long, and I'm a crow," he said stonily. "And you ain't gonna live in the cabin?" "No." That very day, he cut lodge poles in the forest and set them up beside the big oak tree, lashing them securely at the top and spreading them at the bottom into a roomy circle. Over this framework he stretched his hides, elk, deer, buffalo, anything he had in his possibles, patched out with rabbit skins. He worked on it for several hours, making a backrest and a bed frame of willow and rawhide to furnish it, hanging more hides in a heavy circular curtain inside, stuffing dried grass snugly under the outer edges until it looked uncivilized and good and natural. He moved his pack and his few belongings into it that evening. The first real break was made. From then on, the gulf widened continually. Jim cooked his own food at his own times, eating whenever the mood took him. He lived, dressed, and even bathed in his own wild way, in a sweat lodge he built just upstream from the raft landing. He would disappear into it for long periods with a pile of heated stones, then dash out in a burst of steam to plunge into the icy river and swim till he was exhausted. He took no part in the whittling and pounding and creating with which the others were busy as the cabin slowly acquired benches and shelves and utensils and beds and cupboards. He ranged the hills on buckskin or brooded on his grizzly robe while the rain drummed on the hides of his lodge, or prowled with Moki and Daniel through the woods, taking refuge in the only companionship that offered him unqualified approval. Johnny, sick at heart, found himself involved in a desperate tug-of-war over Daniel. The boy had lost interest in the cabin as soon as Jim did, begging to move out to the teepee too. Refused that in no uncertain terms. He compensated by being with Jim every minute he was not actually engaged in doing chores. There were chores aplenty, but even Johnny's enthusiasm had dimmed. The work was a burden. "Seems like we'll never get through with all this, so's I can start clearing land," he growled irritably one day, more to himself than Daniel. As the two worked together behind the cabin, Johnny finishing the last of the bed frames, the boy gouging out the inside of a bowl. "I gotta have the wheat planted this spring or I can't pay off that debt. And a garden. Certainly, we have to have a garden." "Aw, you and Sally, you're always worrying about something. We got along just fine setting on the ground and eating our fish and pemmican off of bark with our fingers." Daniel waved a contemptuous hand at the pile of newly made wooden forks on the grass between them. "What's the good of bothering with all this foo-for-ah? You're a regular bourgeois." "And you're a regular rubber stamp of Jim Keith," exploded Jonathan. "By golly, if he says a thing of a mornin', I get it back from you before nightfall. Ain't you got a mind of your own no more?" "Sure I do," Daniel came back at him defiantly. "I got a mind to be just like Jim, and you ain't gonna stop me." "Oh, Lord," thought Jonathan, clawing back his tumbled hair wearily. I shouldn't have busted out at him like that. He'll turn clean against me. How do you go about raising a young'un anyhow? How do you handle him?" January slipped into February, with the quiet, constant rain, shadowing the valley, and the teepee, standing there always before Johnny's eyes like a symbol of the split in the family and his inability to mend it. The cabin, at last complete and livable, he turned to his land. The stumps and blackberry thickets began to disappear, laboriously, one by one, from the western acre of the glades, where the first wheat field would come into being. "Johnny, you look plumb beat," Rutledge said one evening as he walked slowly down to the raft landing with a borrowed candle mold. "Ain't Jim helped you at all, son?" "I doubt Jim will be around much longer, Mr. Rutledge," Johnny said. "When the snow melts up yonder in the mountains, he'll go back." "Johnny, I bet he won't. Jim's tamed down considerable since I first saw him that day in the Dalles." "He ain't no more tame than Mokey, Mr. Rutledge. Not underneath. Watch him sometime. Watch his eyes." "I been watching him." Rutledge drew deep on his pipe and talked around the stem. "You know, Johnny, I feel mighty sorry for Jim." "Sorry for him?" The big man nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "He don't seem to belong nowheres. He ain't an Injun, but he ain't quite a white man either. He's kind of a homeless critter." "That wouldn't bother Jim none," Jonathan said bitterly. "He don't need no home." Rutledge thought that over, with his huge hand cupped around his pipe and the smoke wreathing his head. "Johnny, you're wrong," he said at last. "Ain't ever a man born on this side of the earth that don't need a home. On this earth that don't need a home." Johnny tried to believe him. He wanted desperately to believe him, but deep in his heart he couldn't. Jim had stayed away too long. He was too much Injun. It was too late. Johnny and Sally were plagued these days by small articles mysteriously disappearing from the cabin and its environs, then reappearing just as mysteriously, exactly where they had been last seen. Dan'l was harder than ever to find when there was water to be fetched or wood to be chopped. The more settled and civilized the life around Jim became, the more restless and caged he felt. What did you do with yourself with no enemies to outwit, or signs to read, or distances to gauge, or routes to find, or hazards to watch out for? What did you do when you neither fought nor escaped, were neither hunted nor hunted?" "You chopped trees," thought Jim resentfully. "You aired blankets and built cabins and tables and fussed with oxen and measured off a beaver's worth of land and built fences around yourself and turned farmer." "Oh, no," thought Jim, "not me. Nobody's going to build a fence around Tox alone." He could go kill a deer, but it seemed foolish. They had plenty of jerky. He could ride up to the falls and talk to the old one-eyed ferryman, Takia, known to the settlers as Jake. The old man's skull was flattened to a point after the manner deemed stylish by his people. And in addition to Chinook jargon, he spoke real Chinook, a guttural, clucking, sputtering language which ignored the use of the tongue entirely and had to be croaked out with the lower part of the throat. That had been hilariously amusing at first, but now it had lost its flavor. Well then, he could go out to the new field and grub out stumps along with Johnny. And with a scowl, Jim would be off up the Tualatin or into the woods, anywhere away from the clearing and everything in it. He was almost ready to buck the gorge again and get clear away, back to Absaroka and the stretching wilderness, or to the cottonwoods, rustling along the banks of the quiet beaver streams. "You ran away from Absaroka too," said the nagging voice inside him. "The streams are trapped out now, remember?" But every time the thought of Absaroka drifted across his mind, his games with Dan'l grew a little more reckless. They were playing a new game now, a dangerously exciting one for Jim as well as Dan'l, for it stirred his memory like distant war drums. It always started out the same way, with Jim leaning over Dan'l, unnoticed by the others, and whispering, "Follow." Then he would disappear into the oak woods or through the willows, Mokey at his heels, and the boy would watch his chance slip watch his chance and slip away after him. "We lost 3 horses in the Sioux raid yesterday," Jim would say sternly when they came together some distance from the clearing, "and we need 3 in their place. More if you can get 'em. I'll wait to the count of 200 afore I stampede their loose stock. Best be out of there afore the alarm spreads." Eyes shining with excitement, Daniel would slip stealthily back to the clearing, which in his mind and Jim's had now become a Sioux village. Of course, to make everything proper, he would be wearing a wolfskin and a coating of the Absaroka mud that dried gray as a wolf's fur over his arms and face. But Jim had reluctantly departed from tradition because the sight of a wolf, so usual as to go unnoticed by the Crow squaws he had outwitted in his own boyhood, would attract Jonathan's immediate and murderous attention. Among bourgeois, the best disguise was no disguise at all. Counting the agreed 200, he would drift toward the glades, and a sudden, unexplainable disturbance would break out amongst the animals, the oxen, Buckskin, and the mule. "Now, what are them critters so excited about?" Sally would exclaim, stopping short on her way to the cabin with an armload of brush cuttings. "Dunno. They keep actin' that-a-way lately." Jonathan would leave off sharpening his axe and frown toward the glades. Must be some varmint around the woods there. "Well, they're calming down now." Sally would vanish into the cabin, only to emerge a moment later, flushed and exasperated. "Now where did them rawhide strings get away to? I cut 'em just special to bind me a broom out of this stuff, and they was right here not 5 minutes ago." "I'll cut you some more, sis. Hey, where's my knife? Why, it was stuck right in the stump." And by this time, Daniel would be off in the woods, proudly dumping in front of Jim the strings, knife, and the squirrel-tailed duster Sally had not yet missed. 3 horses. Good. Can you count coo? "Yeah, Jim, honest, I can this time. I touched Johnny on the back of his collar afore I took that knife, and he never even knew I was there." Jim's stern mask would vanish before a grin. "All right, when you've counted 20 coo, I'll take you to steal a real horse. Now hang around, out of sight, till the fuss dies down. Then go put 'em all back." But one day, Ned Rutledge and his father were in the clearing, lingering on the way back from a trip to the Willamette Falls, and Daniel's horses included Ned's Jew's harp, which the boy had long coveted. It led him to protest the familiar order to put 'em all back. "Shucks, Jim, why do I have to? You never used to put back the stuff you practiced on." "Well, we allus stole meat off of dryin' racks. That's why we wore the wolfskins, 'cause they was allus wolves stealin' the jerky anyways. But you mustn't ever steal nothing valuable." Daniel frowned up at him, bewildered. "Horses are valuable. Real horses, I mean." "Oh, well, that's different. Ain't no other way to get a good horse." Jim paused, frowning a little. Here in this valley, that remark didn't sound quite the simple statement of fact it would have in Absaroka. He thought a minute, then amended slowly. "What I mean is, you don't steal nothing valuable from your own people, just your enemies. Now, go take them things back." But there were no enemies here, he thought after the boy was gone. It was a queer life without them. It was what made this valley so uneasy. He kept feeling there was something missing, that you'd neglected something. You kept listening but not hearing anything except the wind in the trees, or the river whispering next to you, or the nagging, incessant sound of Johnny's axe. Nothing ever happened. He padded restlessly through the wet woods, feeling as though he'd give almost anything for the sight of a war bonnet and a painted face emerging from the bushes ahead of him, for a sudden spring and the yell, splitting the silence, and the wild ferocity blazing up inside himself, with something right there to vent it on. The only enemies he had now were the things he couldn't fight: a clock, a cabin, a bleakness in Johnny's eyes. He snarled suddenly and broke into a run, dodging between the dripping trees with Moki panting behind. In a spurt for the glades, If he couldn't fight, at least he could ride, fast and hard enough to forget all this for a while. He broke cover at the top of the ridge behind the cabin and bounded across the open space between the woods and the fir grove, running along its edge until the ground dipped and then flattened out into the broad stretch of the glades. Buckskin was grazing yonder along with the oxen, Rutledge's bay horse and his own mule. She took fright the moment he darted out of the underbrush toward her, and he raced to cut her off, everything in him responding to the joy of violent action. Moki, equally delighted, flattened himself into a furry streak and dashed around Buckskin's other flank, yapping and snarling, almost under her pounding hoofs. She brought up short in a rear, wheeled, and found Jim directly in her path. As she reared again, he leaped with her, clinging to the rawhide rope she wore for a halter. In another instant, he was half on her back, one leg flung over and a hand twisted in her mane, sticking like a burr and yelling with delight as she plunged and raced across the glades. Plastered to her offside, he screeched a war whoop and aimed imaginary arrows over her tossing neck at the oxen milling confusedly on the other side of the field. As the mare swerved at the other end of the glades and turned sharply back, he lashed upright and then down again under her other shoulder, feeling her mane whip his face and the wind tear past as he pressed his cheek against her smooth rolling muscles. He was halfway back to the fir grove, laughing at the turmoil he was causing among the rest of the animals, when he caught sight of Johnny coming down the near side of the ridge. His excitement dimmed instantly. He fought the overwrought mare into some semblance of control and pulled himself upright, catching the halter into a tight loop. A string of crow gutturals, alternately cursing and comforting, steadied her to a jerky canter, and he halted her with a final wheeling rear alongside his brother. "What's up?" he demanded, as he slid to the ground. "Nothing's up. I just came to fetch Mr. Rutledge's horse. I got to watching you." Johnny's eyes met his. "You make a good sight to see, you and that mare." The words were as direct and simple as the look, and they filled Jim with wonder. Why, it was a truce. Johnny was tired of this silent war, as tired as he was himself. Almost afraid to speak, for fear of spoiling the moment, Jim muttered, "She's a good horse. Fast as light, ain't she?" Johnny flashed a quick, hesitant smile, then actually laughed as the mare reared impatiently, and he sprang out of range of the plunging hoofs. "Criminy, she's a beauty, but mighty wild." "I like her wild," Jim admitted. "I scared her a purpose so she'd kick up her heels and give me a little fun." "Why'n't you try her onct?" he added suddenly. "What? Me ride that critter? Lord, she'd dump me the first half minute. Plow horses is about all I've ever rode." "Try her anyhow." Jim was grinning now, thoroughly pleased with his idea. "Stand aside then. No tellin' what'll happen." Johnny moved eagerly to the mare's side and was halted by a whoop from Jim. "Hey, hold on. Don't come at her from that side or she'll kick you into the middle of next week. This here's an Injun horse. Get on her from the right." "The right? Feels all backwards." Jonathan circled obediently, then stood there, scratching his head and laughing. "By golly, you make it tough enough. No saddle, no stirrups." "Grab her mane. She's used to me yanking on it." "Ho there, Buckskin, take it easy. You're skittering, you skittering little squaw." Jim soothed her in the guttural tongue she knew and trusted, while Johnny grasped a handful of mane and pulled himself astride her. Instantly, her head tossed up, jerking the halter from Jim's hand and all but unseating Johnny. But he only gave a shout of laughter and hung on, sticking with her as she whirled and made off for the far ends of the glades. He managed to stay on, though, through her abrupt, snagging turn, and through most of her deer-like flight back. But then Jim saw him tugging on the halter to stop her, and knew trouble was coming. It came in short order. Buckskin didn't want to stop. She wanted to run, and as soon as Johnny's tugging grew insistent, she decided she wanted to buck and pitch too. Jonathan sailed over her head in a graceful curve, landed in a rolling scramble of legs and arms, and sat up, dazedly watching her receding heels. Jim was laughing so hard he could barely hoist his brother to his feet. By gor, that was the prettiest sight I ever see. Any bones broken? Johnny shook his head after a gingerly investigation of his anatomy. Darn fool thing to do anyhow, he said with a grin. I knew I couldn't handle her. By gor, you ought to have one. You ought to have one, you kin. You ought to have some kind of horse. You're all as needin' one. I know. But that don't get me one. Johnny combed his fingers through his hair. By golly, I wished I had one just like Buckskin. After a day of grubbing stumps. Ain't nobody making you grub stumps all day long. Johnny let it pass. He shrugged and tried to grin, but the barriers were up again between them. Well, Mr. Rutledge will be down here in a minute, wondering if I fell in the creek. I better get his pony. He started for the corner to which Rutledge's horse had retreated. Jib watched him go. An idea struck him, as brilliant began to form in his mind. For weeks he'd been wishing he could do something to make Johnny look at him again, just once, as he had that day in the recorder's office. Now he believed he'd found it. He started on a run to catch Buckskin. When Johnny topped the rise back of the cabin, Rutledge's horse in tow, Jim was beside him on the mare, panting a little with exercise and inward excitement, hoping he could get his rifle from the lodge and his medicine bundle from the hollow stump upriver where he'd hidden it, safe from prying eyes, and be out of the clearing before anyone asked too many questions.